Participants in that study, actually, both the folks who organized the study and wrote about it and documented and analyzed it, as well as one of the testers here with us tonight to share their insights on the study and its implications and its ramifications on policy. So first, to my immediate left, Olivia Winslow has worked at Newsday for 30 years, currently is a general assignment reporter and is the demographics reporter, which involves analyzing census data for insight into how Long Island's population is changing. She's a graduate of Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she received a bachelor's degree in print journalism, and of Temple University in Philadelphia, where she received a master's in journalism. She has previously worked at the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Danbury News-Times. She's also a music lover. A favorite venue is Jazz at Lincoln Center, as well as a church singer. Next, to her left, Keith Herbert is an investigations editor at Newsday on Long Island. He was an investigative reporter at Newsday for 6 years before becoming an editor. He was a member of the Newsday team that won the Polk Award in 2020 for this report, Long Island Divided. And he was the lead reporter on the project and assisted with the testing methodology, tester recruitment, and test preparation. He served as a producer and primary narrator for the 40-minute documentary that accompanied the investigative stories, and that documentary won a Peabody Award. Keith has also worked for NBC News Digital, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Morning Call in Allentown. He graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia with a Bachelor's of Arts in Journalism, and he is former president of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists and vice president of the Press Club of Long Island. To his left, Dr. Martine Hackett is chair of the Department of Population Health at Hofstra University and the director of the Master of Public Health program. Her research and community-based work is focused on maternal child health, suburban health equity, and the intersection of health and housing. She was the co-founder of Birth Justice Warriors, an organization committed to eliminating Black maternal and infant mortality in Nassau County. She was also a tester for the Newsday investigation and has been a commentator on her participation in the work as well as its implications. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. I'd like to actually begin in the middle of the row with Keith Herbert. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis of this report, how the idea for this research came about, and how Newsday kind of laid the foundations for the research, organized the research.
Sure. Thank you all for inviting us. It's a pleasure to still be talking about Long Island Divided, going on 4 years after it's been published. And you're right in your introduction talking about all the things that were going on from a sociological perspective, particularly in the mid part of the 2015, 2016, when we started this endeavor. And primarily, I'm talking about, and Olivia can talk more about this, Long Island was undergoing a change demographically around 2015, 2016, when we first started contemplating doing Long Island Divided. It didn't have a title back then. It was just sort of a twinkling in an editor's eye about doing a story about discrimination in housing. Why? Because we knew that Long Island was getting more diverse from the census data that Olivia analyzes. We knew that Long Island, while getting more diverse, was remaining segregated. So the historical segregation pattern that had existed in Nassau and Suffolk County was cemented and not changing at the same time. The island itself was getting more diverse. And we had always heard, and there are cases here and there that popped up about instances of racial steering, where real estate agents would send a person of color to one neighborhood based upon the racial makeup of the home buyer or the neighborhood itself. The only way to get at this was, if you're going to do an investigation, is to involve some form of testing. Testing meaning one person of color goes to the same agent and tries to get a home. A few days later, you send in non-person of color, and you measure the level of treatment, whether it's equal, whether there's disparate treatment, whether the white person gets more homes to look at than the person of color. So it was out of that we said, let's try to examine and take a look at this, because we know it goes on based upon what we could find in our library's clips and a few state cases as a matter of public record. And all we need was smart, bright, dedicated people like Martine to go out and do the testing and wear a camera and recording equipment, which is legal, by the way, in New York. And we were off to the races. We had a goal of doing 100. We did more than 100, but we only counted 90 of them.
86.
Thank you. And that's how it got started.
Martine, I wonder if you want to speak at all to your experience as a tester with.
Sure. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into, for sure, but I knew this was something that I was interested in finding out more about. And so I remember going to Newsday's offices, I guess in 2017, right around then, and being told about the project and recognizing, being asked what it is I would have to do. And part of what I had to do was to each time that we went in for a test, we had a profile. So we had name, phone numbers, background, and the reason why we were looking for the house in the particular neighborhood. And so we had to have that story really straight, and as Keith mentioned, also have our camera and our recording of this. And, there was a lot of training that we had in terms of, what we could say, what we couldn't say, and the ways that you had to sort of present yourself. And I think that, throughout that process, it was just sort of, day in and day out, we would do it and, come back in and check back in. And, that took place over 2 years, and it was really hard to really know what was happening with it, from, just from my perspective. And it really wasn't until, they brought the two testers together that really we started to see what the results were, the data were. And it, you saw it in the reel that, it was an unbelievable feeling to just sort of be presented with that, information about, here's how you were treated, here's how, the, white person was treated, and to have it be so different. I didn't expect it to be so emotional, but it really was, and yet it was also data, that we were able to use that Newsday was able to use to be able to, make the case quantitatively to determine that there was steering that was happening. So I would say from my perspective, it seemed like something that, you just sort of did day to day, and it wasn't until it all came together did you realize the significance.
And I wonder, Olivia, if you want to jump off of that in terms of telling us a little bit about how Newsday used the data that you collected from the testers to tell a story and how you presented it to the public. I'm sorry, go on.
As Martine said, it wasn't until she was brought in and the other testers were brought in when she had an idea of what had transpired and the differences in how the testers were treated based on their color. And so just to back up, if I could, Professor, Keith talked about the demographics are changing on Long Island. So, and it's been a steady change. Currently, based on the 2020 census, Long Island's racial makeup is now, or was, based on the 2020 census, just over 40% minority and just under 60% white. 10 years prior, in 2010, it was 31.3% minority and 68.7% white. So we have a diversifying population. However, there are rigid, or as one sociologist described it to me, there are hard white walls, is the term that he used, Professor Orfield, Myron Orfield, you might know that name, on Long Island. And so there are demarcations that you can see, and that in some instances was demonstrated by how the realtors presented listings to our testers. So our testers went in, and they didn't, it wasn't a neighborhood they were requesting. It was a broad, give me 30 minutes of Bethpage or 20 minutes of Central Islip or Bayshore. And so that we did that, so we didn't say I want to live in Bethpage. I want to live within 30 minutes of Bethpage because, I've got a mother I want to keep an eye on, or I work. And so our testers would have profiles, and one of the reasons for the camera, the hidden cameras, was that we could see whether our testers said things the same way, the way they were supposed to say it. So yes, we did more than 100 tests, but some of those tests we threw out because there was an error, let's say, in the descriptions that our testers gave. They weren't quite equal, so we didn't think it was fair. So anyway, realtors had a broad area to look, to provide listings for what they thought were prospective home buyers, but were actually Newsday testers. So that it is how the realtors, they gave a white tester a particular area, and our research showed that white testers got more listings than minority testers. Let's see, overall agents gave Newsday's white testers 50% more listings than they gave black testers, 39 compared to 26. There wasn't such a gap with other minorities. Agents gave Hispanic and white paired testers 42 listings. Asians received 18 compared to 22 for white listings. But the wider gap was between the black and white testers, right? Minority areas here on Long Island were often overlooked for everybody. That was a surprise to us, wasn't it, Keith? We thought that it would be more likely that the agents would give minority testers more listings in minority communities, but the agents often avoided minority areas. Those were some of the, and there was, you saw in the reel, minority testers were subjected to more disparate treatment. Often one of those areas was in the request that, I'm forgetting the terminology, Keith, that they be pre-approved, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You
That's
got
when
that? Did you often get that, Martine?
Yeah, for a mortgage.
And there was one of our white testers, a young white woman, she was never asked for pre-approval. I mean, never. So, it was interesting. And then there were some comments that the real estate agents gave that indicated their bias. One real estate agent told one of our testers, and I believe this told one of our Asian testers, actually, I'm not going to give you any listings in Wyandanch unless you don't want to start your car to buy crack, which would suggest that a heavily minority community was a place that was undesirable and, filled with dope fiends, crack fiends or something. So, other schools were often, real estate agents are told not to even talk about schools, even though that is not against the law to talk about schools. What the problem is when they make comments of quality. That's where they run into trouble. And several agents we discovered would use school ratings as a proxy for demographics or race. And some of them ran afoul, according to our consultants that Newsday used. We used a legal scholar on housing discrimination, Robert Schwemm, who wrote the definitive textbook on housing discrimination that's used across the land, and then Fred Freiberg of right here in Queens, the Housing Justice Center, who has been litigating these issues and conducting tests throughout the country for a couple of decades. So they would look at, so it took us a while to figure out what we had, essentially. And our experts helped us clarify what we had that was significant.
I think one of the most striking things about your report for me, as someone who's read some of the literature, is just that, I mean, these types of pair tests have been done before, right? They've been done at the regional level by groups like Long Island Housing Services. They've been done at the national level by HUD, most recently in 2012, right? They've done it every decade or so. But there's something about the visuals of this report and the recordings that really makes the impact immediate. I wondered if either of you, Olivia or Keith, whether you want to say anything about the way that the material was presented to the public to kind of maximize its impact.
Yes. I remembered one thing from your previous question. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, 50th anniversary was coming up in 2018. We missed that deadline, but we wanted to try to get it done by then. So, the video, right, and the audio. There's a lot of testing that does go on. Local groups do it. As I mentioned, New York is a one-party state, which means you only need the consent of one person involved in a conversation to record it. So we took advantage of that. We recorded something like 200 hours of video. Why did we go to that monstrosity of work? Well, the reason is because we didn't want anyone to be able to challenge us with respect to the sort of the quality of the tests that we did. We wanted there to be a record that everybody could see and examine for themselves and determine whether Newsday had conducted a fair test. Olivia can tell you because she watched 90% of the video of these tests. Each one of these tests was about 45 minutes probably on average. And we wanted to record the transcripts of it so that there could be a written record of what was said and what was exchanged, so that if one tester of color went in and was denied service based upon the fact that they didn't have a pre-approval from a bank, and then a white tester went in and there was no mention of a pre-approval and things went swimmingly, we would have a record of that. Because as you mentioned, Chris, the number one attack on fair housing testing, particularly this type of audit testing, is the quality of your test was deficient, and therefore you really can't draw any conclusions about whether there was disparate treatment or discrimination. Well, we wanted to make sure that we knocked that down from the start. That's why we did the time and expense to, put people in a position to record what was said. Most of the time, the testing just uses audio recording. I haven't seen that many that use video. We had the benefit of a wealthy publisher who wanted to get these answers as much as we did. So that's what allowed us to do it.
And I believe HUD I don't believe HUD even uses audio. The testers write out their reports of what happened.
Yeah, the courts will accept audio recording as evidence, and it's sufficient there. We wanted to go beyond that.
But not, I guess it's not required, and so the public seldom sees that, this type of evidence.
Unless, a member of the public goes to the courthouse and digs through the files and pulls out the actual case and looks for the transcripts, and that they wouldn't know how it's done, yeah.
But also, you know, we were in this era of major politician talking about fake news. So can you imagine if we had not recorded these interactions, what people would be saying, or the criticism? Well, why should we believe that? Well, we have the video evidence showing you.
It's right there in front of your eyes. So tell us a little bit about the impact of this report, because I mean it certainly had impacts at different scales, particularly the regional and the state level scale. What types of changes did it set in motion, and how optimistic do you feel now 4 years later about the direction of reform?
Yeah, the impact was immediate. You know, the first thing that I remember happening was the real estate industry itself on Long Island. You know, after we would call for reaction from them, you know, okay, you got us. You know, we're not going to challenge you in any specific way. I remember being at a banquet, and there was a table of real estate agents from the Long Island Board of Realtors, and they came up to me and said, you know, thank you for doing that. You know, you really showed where there are some deficiencies in how we do business. There's a lobbying group up in Albany that works on issues surrounding real estate agents and their licenses, and the reaction was the same from that individual, is that we want to be an agent for change for the deficiencies that you pointed out in your report. Eventually, this kind of turned into state Senate hearings where evidence was gathered.
Held right here at Hofstra.
Held at Hofstra. Our editor, Arthur Brown, testified about the report, which is a bit unusual. That turned into some legislation. Not all the companies that Newsday wrote about appeared for all those hearings. And the new governor signed legislation that increased the fines for real estate agents who are licensed by the state if they engaged or demonstrably have engaged in things like racial steering or treating people differently based upon race. Also increased the training requirements. Also made available a hotline so that anyone that thinks they're being discriminated against can call and report it. But perhaps the most important thing is that it created a fund and set aside some money that, in theory, could go towards doing more testing. And that testing is important because, as Martine pointed out, if you're a person looking for a home, no matter what your color is, and you go in, you have no idea how the next person that comes in the door is treated compared to how you were treated. The only way to get at this discrimination, because it's hidden, is to do testing so that that interaction and the service can be compared person to person.
And the United States Supreme Court has ruled that testing is basically the gold standard to determine housing discrimination. In addition, prior to the state legislatures coming up with various rules governing real estate agents' behavior and increasing testing, also the Attorney General's office has dedicated or said they would dedicate more funding to testing. The counties, both counties, Nassau and Suffolk counties, at least in Nassau, the prior administration had beefed up the Human Rights Division to handle housing discrimination complaints. Suffolk as well. I believe that in Suffolk County they've gone a little bit further in designating funding for testing. So now testing, even HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, gives housing agencies across the country money to conduct testing. It's just, and the attorney, all these different state entities have the ability to conduct testing. The problem has been over the decades is not much has been done to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. So that is the situation that the Long Island Divided Report came into, and then all of these government entities kind of discovered that the role that they have to play in rooting out housing discrimination.
You asked if any of us was optimistic, and Olivia is the optimistic one.
We haven't seen anything yet.
Right. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that this has put sort of, racial steering or discrimination on the radar screen of politicians. We did something about racial steering home and the real estate market here on Long Island, but you're already seeing people do stories about appraisal and appraisal discrimination, and a black person gets home appraised at one number, and the next hour goes by, and then a white person, the same house, gets appraised at a higher number. So this type of examination of economic equity, to me, is something to be optimistic about.
I'd also say, just in terms of like the response, just in terms of like the general discourse, I think it just has, like Keith mentioned, it's just brought it up. People just talk about it more now. I've just had people tell me about like how it's in like family group text, when this report came out, and how people, it offered people sort of in one way a sense of like, I knew this, and here's this sort of confirmation of something I already knew. On the flip side, some people are like, we already knew this. Why did you even have to do this? Which I find interesting. But the point is that I think what it did do, and it still does, I think it's still something that people, when you talk about things like racial residential segregation, you talk about housing issues, that this story is one of the touchstones about, how this looks in the modern day. Because again, it's because it hadn't been done, or certainly not at this level for so many decades, it brought to the attention that this is still a current issue that we're dealing with, even though it might not have the same level of attention that it once did.
And it happened at a time when it was common for people to say, racism is on the wane, and we're post-racial. This was sort of a slap in the face, if that's your line of thinking.
And just, I want to ask Martine, a lot of your work, your day job, is as a professor specializing in public health, and a lot of your research investigates some of the links between housing and health. Do you want to say anything about kind of give folks kind of an idea of what some of the stakes are involved in this issue of housing discrimination? Like, what impact do these practices have for the rest of people's lives?
Yeah, I think that most people can think about the connections between housing and family generational wealth. You can think about the connections between housing and schools and school districts, but I think the connection between housing and health is often disassociated from people, because a lot of us think that our health is individual, right? That if you just do the right things, if you have a good doctor, then your health is sort of, set. And if you don't have those things, then that's going to be the problem. And I think that we have to realize that our environment that we're in has a huge impact on our health outcomes. And the idea, when it comes to looking at health differences in a place like Nassau County, for example, we can see by zip code very different health outcomes. So COVID is a most recent example, obviously, thinking about how COVID cases and COVID deaths looked very different as you sort of drive down Hempstead Turnpike, for example, right? And those were correlated with communities of color, and which were also these racially segregated communities. And racial residential segregation is a fundamental cause of of health disparities or those differences. And it's sometimes it's hard for people to kind of really understand that, right? Is it because of, how much money people have? Is it, and it's hard to sort of, connect those dots. But a lot of it has to do on one level with stress and the stressors that are engendered by the neighborhood that you live in, and thinking about the socioeconomic status that people who are living in certain neighborhoods where, as Keith mentioned, that your house might be worth less than a house that's 2 miles away, even though it's exactly the same house, but because it's in a different zip code or a different school district, it's worth less. And the stressors that happen around crime, stressors that happen around maintaining your place in the world and your family's place in the world, all of these things, right, play a role in how our bodies react. And so our bodies have a way of being responsive to those stressors that then present as disease. And so when I think about the issue of that Long Island Divided brought up, I do think about the issues of health, because by maintaining the racial segregation, you are also maintaining the health inequities that exist in a place like Long Island.
I want to invite, at this point, I think we've had a good conversation, but if folks from the audience also have questions, I want to point out that there are 2 microphones at the front of the room, and you should feel free to come to the front if folks want to ask the panelists any questions, and we'll open up the Q&A as we see folks with. Oh, okay. I thought that you were.
No.
You're walking up. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. In your exploration of redlining as evidence of systemic racism, have you explored, or are you curious to explore, how that directly affects gerrymandering or its relationship with gerrymandering, and if politicians would even be willing to make a difference in this aspect if it's not beneficial to them?
You cover politics.
I get the easy ones. That's a good question. I'm going to give you the best answer I can about Long Island Divided. And the short answer is no. And that's because, it seemed like a big sprawling investigation and all that, but it was really a question that we wanted to answer was, is the real estate industry in any way playing a role in the historical segregation that we know exists on Long Island, despite the island getting more and more diverse? We didn't want to get involved in, the politics of it. Does the Nassau Republican Party keep Nassau segregated because it helps them get elected? Perhaps, but we don't know, and we didn't want to investigate that. We wanted to answer a simple question. We didn't even know if the first few tests we did, whether, it was going to answer the question. We were very surprised when, we watched some of the video and saw some things that were clearly disparate treatment. But that's a very smart question. It makes some connections that we didn't let our ambition take us into. But it's fair game, and smart people like yourself have at it.
Hi. A comment and a question. The comment is, I so appreciate that your study wasn't just kind of the steering part of it, it was also the financial part of it. Because the ones in the past that have been done on Long Island were more about just the steering, and they didn't ask the pre-approved kind of question, and what will you show me? So that was a whole nother piece that I didn't know anything about, so thank you. The question is, you alluded to it was alluded to actually on the video, and then a discussion about what you could and couldn't say as a realtor. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about schools, because obviously people can look up in Newsday the school report cards, which are quite different depending on what communities you live in, and then it affects housing prices in those communities. And in fact, the day those come out every year, you know, all the scores, people chat around about their housing prices in various districts. So I wonder what's allowed and what is not allowed.
Schools was something I focused on pretty heavily in the report. I've got, there's like 13 stories that are part of Long Island Divided. In 2 of them, one deals with the school issues and the other deals with the segregation and how the schools factor into that. But real estate agents are told, because schools are often seen or as a proxy, as I said earlier, for race or how well a school district does. And in Long Island, we've got 124 school districts, right? New York City's got 1. In other places where I've worked, you have county school districts, like in Richmond, Virginia, or town districts, like in Danbury, Connecticut, and surrounding towns. But on Long Island, you've got these 124, actually it's 125 when you include Flower Hill, which is for disabled students. And some of them are very small. And so the way the real estate agents that we saw dealt with the school issues was this school. Well, you talked about the school ratings. That's a whole nother issue. Some of the ratings, like great schools, how they rate schools is questionable. That's one thing. The other thing is that they don't take into consideration how some schools in minority areas are doing well. They may not be, well, Elmont, let's use Elmont as an example. Elmont has gotten awards from the federal government and New York State as schools of blue ribbon schools, dispelling the myth. Elmont has a high graduation rate in the mid-90s of black boys, but yet we have a couple of realtors that we looked at that were tested that said, you don't want to go to Elmont. I don't think you should be in Elmont. Their schools, all right. So the real estate agents, the real estate trade organizations tell the real estate agents you have to be very careful about schools. You cannot provide an opinion about schools. You should send prospective home buyers to wherever to get their information about schools. It's not that they can't say anything about schools. They can't give their opinion about how well or how bad a school district is. Some of the agents that we tested stated their opinions. And yet, or as one of our experts, Fred Freiberg, said, who made them experts? It may not be the best or the school district with the highest scores that I'm looking to send my child to. This school might have a good music program. That's why I want my child to go there. So, but the way some of the real estate agents talked about schools, it was very clearly a proxy for race.
Okay.
And making the assumption if that neighborhood or that area has a high minority population, if you're white, don't go there.
Yeah, and it sounds like also if you're minority, don't go there for some of the, that's also surprising in the study, isn't it? I mean, that they were steering everybody away from certain places too. But anyway, thank you very much, appreciate it.
Hi there. Could you talk more about the school scores? I moved here 15 years ago. I feel very tall right now. I moved here 15 years ago and from a desktop studied the schools, and I got school scores. And when I moved here, I ended up in a neighborhood that was almost exclusively white. And I said that to a colleague of mine, and he said, well, how did you decide where to move? And he said, I said, I used a score for the school. And he said, well, that's a proxy for race. And I went back and looked because I was certain that wasn't true, and it was, because it was based largely, based on my reading, on free and reduced school lunches. That's what the score was based on, which can work very well, to identify, well is not the best way to put it, but to identify communities of color. And I had inadvertently picked a very white community to move to. And so I'm curious about those scores, and I'm also curious about other factors people use when they choose their communities. We're talking about real estate agents directing people. I picked schools. How else are people picking their communities when they move here?
Well, that wasn't something we investigated. I mean, the schools issue came up because so many realtors we sent our testers to talked about the schools. Martine, do you?
Well, yeah, and also we were trained to not bring up schools, you know, even though we supposedly had children, you know, we were told not to ask, how are the schools here?
So, but the real estate agent, many of them brought schools up because, and I went to a conference at Teachers College as we were doing this, and one of the teachers, college professors, Amy Stewart Wells, studied, she was the lead author, and Douglas Reedy, I believe, was another, who studied the 56 school districts in Nassau County. Anyway, I go to this conference and they're talking about that particular study. And one of the things that Dr. Wells had mentioned to me when I interviewed her later was, and I had written a story, a Newsday story about the report when it came out, you know, that prior year, whenever it was.
And this was a Long Island Index, I think, right?
Yeah.
09 or something.
Or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, and what was interesting, one of the things that she talked about was they actually looked at the houses of people living in minority communities in Nassau County versus people living predominantly white communities. And in some instances, and you know how Long Island is, Hempstead Village butts up against Garden City, right? The dividing line between Garden City and Hempstead is Meadow Street. When you're driving on Clinton Road, you're coming from Old Country Road and Roosevelt Field Mall. Well, that dividing street is Meadow, and you go from all these trees you see in Garden City to not very many trees when you're staying on Clinton. But anyway, it's just that the houses can be the same square footage, have the same amenities, but if it's and it depends on what the breakdown is in the minority communities. If it's 30%, there's going to be a certain percentage of less of the home value, and if it's 50% minority community, it's even less, right? So, and then I would hear other experts talk about, you know, there's this thing, you want your child to go to the best school district you can afford. But the way it works in Long Island, it's cut up in these tiny, tiny districts, whereas in other communities you have, you know, it might be county-wide. And so the children are not locked into a lesser performing district, and they get fewer resources, or the resources they get has to go for other kinds of programs to deal with immigrant students who are coming in and need language assistance and all of the rest. So, you know, I don't know, there's all these issues. I don't see where the gentleman went, but, okay. Oh, there you are. So, you know, it's a conundrum, I suppose. I don't know, I can't figure it out. Other than change the way the school districts are formed so that there's a greater chance that no matter a child's race or financial resources, they have an opportunity, they have a similar opportunity to gain the education that children who come from richer families have.
I'll just say real quickly, Olivia is telling you absolutely the truth, because it seemed like every time someone went into an office, the real estate agent was talking about schools, and you want to be near good schools and the quality of your schools. One of the pernicious things is racial steering, and 25% of the tests that we did showed some evidence of racial steering. We didn't calculate how many times an agent mentioned schools to one of our testers, but I'm sure it would have been above 80%. So the direct answer to your question is, I don't think there is any other measure here on Long Island that is on the mind of people, certainly not the real estate industry. close to a train station, near a park, away from a Superfund site. It doesn't get that detailed.
Perhaps this question is for Professor Hackett. If we were to control for incomes, is there a difference in the health outcomes of communities and people on Long Island?
Yes, there would still be a difference if you controlled for income. And so an example is with maternal mortality. And so that is the death of a person either during pregnancy or right after childbirth or 6 weeks after childbirth. And when you look at income and also education level, a college-educated black woman is going to be more likely to die during that period than a less than high school educated white woman. And that is true, again, across the country, and that is something that, again, sort of speaks to sort of larger issues. And I would say that in part of what, is also happening when we talk about the schools, and from the real estate agent's perspective, Olivia, when you're talking about like Elmont, to me it makes me think of just stereotypes, how powerful stereotypes and people's perceptions of other people that they actually never interact with, I would say. I think because we have this, high level of racial residential segregation in Long Island, our children grow up not knowing children of other races, that because those schools are so segregated. And I think then they grow up with that, they kind of only have these sort of stereotypical perceptions or ideas of who these other people are. And if we take that even to that, like I said, that larger level from healthcare, we start to realize that stereotypes and how people are treated plays a very big role in terms of their health outcomes. And so the research is pretty clear to say that your education and your income can't protect you as a black person.
Next? Oh, okay, hi, thanks. Excuse me for reading, I just want to kind of make sure I'm asking things sensitively here, actually. But my first question would be, do you think the realtors are actually, do you think the realtors are prioritizing slotting people into specific locations over making a sale that could net them a large amount of $30,000 to $40,000? Do you think that's their priority, is to slot people over making a sale?
No, and I'm giving you opinion based upon experience. It's by no means backed up by any research, but my sense was that real estate agents have a finite amount of time, and this was their quick sort system to determine who is a real buyer and who isn't, and simply trying to guess that perhaps the white person may be a quicker route to a home sale and a profit than the Hispanic tester.
Well, I guess I was, sort of referring to not so much initiating the process, but once the process was underway in selecting, which houses to see per se, that they're driven to show one group a certain amount of houses by the fact of trying to slot them there, or it may possibly their misguided opinion or misinformed opinion or guess that they're just using their best assumption to satisfy the buyer so that a sale can be made. One, so they make money, and two, that the buyer's happy. Maybe the process is a little misguided, or the understanding is misguided, but their intent is to make the sale for both parties to be happy. And some of that is driven in that direction without a malice intent to slot people somewhere.
Yeah, we did see some of that, right? Determining that an assumption of the real estate agent would be, or even expressed in some instances, you'd be more comfortable in more of a mixed neighborhood, or maybe you wouldn't be comfortable more of a mixed neighborhood. That's an assumption about the buyer that the agent probably shouldn't make, because you don't know what would make the person happy unless you have them expressed. Our testers went in and said, give us a home 30 minutes of the city because I want to commute every day. We designed it to give the agents a wide latitude in about how to fulfill the requests of the buyer so that we could read into what the demographics of the homes that were selected for them.
Right, thanks for that answer.
I'm trying to give you the best answer I can give, so.
Okay,
if
no, I
you
appreciate
want
it.
something more pointed, go ahead and
Yeah,
ask it.
I'm trying to ask it hopefully in the best way that it's understandable, so we have a mission. Second question, similar to that or sort of a follow-up. Do you think the do you think the results would have been less egregious if the testers had offered guidance as to which specific townships they were interested in, thus giving the agent a chance to adjust what might have been wrong assumptions when the agents were collecting, houses to look at?
Well, as Keith just said, our goal was to give the agent the latitude. We gave a radius, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or, I want to commute, as he just said, from the city. I don't want to be more than 45 minutes out from the city. So that was done purposely to give the agent's latitude. What would the agent do based on the difference in color? Would that make a difference of the prospective home buyer? So to be more pointed for the tester, the prospective home buyer to say, I just want to live in, Garden City would kind of defeat the purpose.
Yeah, we would have steered ourselves,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my point is that, it seems that the mistakes, if we call that, or indiscretions of the realtors, resulted in, people being slotted to an area. Now, because they didn't know, they didn't have a guidance as to which particular town somebody would want to go to, so they made their best guess, possibly wrong, using wrong logic. However, in looking at if buyers had come in and rather than just say, give me a 10, because in most experiences that I've had, either shopping for houses or speaking with other people who shop for houses, generally we go in kind of looking, asking about townships. For instance, I'd like to look at, you'd mentioned, I'd like to look at Huntington, I'd like to look at Plainview, I'd like to look at Farmingdale. Do you have houses in those areas? Rather than, a 10-mile area per se. So in those cases, which seems to be a normal process, or maybe, in my opinion, possibly a more normal process when you're in that situation of buying a home, the realtor would have those specific towns of to choose from. Now, if the realtor decides that says, no, we have no town, we have no listings in this town, or we don't have this per se, and that's fact, that would definitely be a clear sign of discrimination. If they would deny, but the test didn't seem that they were denial situations as much as just judging what the realtor's approach was into trying to satisfy the buyer,
So I think it seems like what you're speaking to is there's this question of exactly what realtors' motivations were, right? And it sounds as though the answer was potentially a layered one, that there were both biases at play, but also misperceptions or perhaps miseducation on the part of the real estate agents.
Yeah, you can't get into someone's mind.
Mm-hmm.
There are other test programs that may have designed it the very same way that you're describing. We can do some research and determine whether they would have found the evidence of potential discrimination that we found, or they may not have. But we designed it in such a way that we would get the most impact. All right? And that's why we did 100 tests, because we wanted it to be statistically significant. We didn't want it to be 35 tests in Hempstead and then 5 in Garden City to see what would happen. We wanted it to be, from the Queens line all the way out to the Hamptons. And we wanted to give the real estate agent as much room as possible to make the decision, as opposed to us making the decision to see if an agent would give a black person a house in Garden City or a white person a house in Hempstead. There's nothing wrong with doing the test that way, but we being a media organization, we're looking for the widest interest possible, so we designed it the way we did.
So why don't I want to ask kind of a question that might be a little bit of a tangent or a stretch, but I think it's...
I don't know if this gentleman's finished.
One quick thing, and I appreciate your answer, thank you. But in that answer, I was commenting a little bit that, in a way, it could be a two-way thing. One is the realtor is giving more leeway to choose things, but they're also given more leeway to make a mistake than they would if somebody had come in and given a little guidance as to specific areas.
Yeah, I understand your question, but that assumes that no person of color is going to come from Queens and say, I want to live in an affordable neighborhood with the best school possible. And I want to be near the town of Huntington. That's perfectly reasonable.
No, yeah, both cases can exist, yeah, that's true, thank you. Okay, thank you.
And
Yeah,
also,
thank
too,
you.
I think the other is that one thing you didn't mention is that when you did the test, you also gave it back to the realtors, right? After you looked at the comparison, had the realtors comment
yeah.
on it. So the realtors were given the results of the test, right? Maybe I'm getting all the details wrong, but then they had an opportunity to review the information and then comment.
And I believe 20-something realtors took up the opportunity to come to Newsday's offices when we told them, we tested you, and that test was problematic, was the word that we used, and you could come in and review the video. And so 21, 23, 20 some of them came in, and in some instances, we took, in a couple of instances, we took a test out of the problematic file because the real estate agent provided an explanation that was acceptable for how there, why it appeared to us to be disparate. And in other cases, we didn't change anything. The explanation didn't change anything in our view and in our consultant's view. So they had an opportunity. Those, had an opportunity to come into Newsday and to review the video themselves and the listings that they provided, the paired tests, and to offer us an explanation.
Okay,
Thank
yeah,
you.
I didn't see, in reading through the study, it was tough to see what their explanations were in some cases, but anyway, I appreciate it.
Well, most of the time, it was a no comment.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's another question.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Okay, sorry. It's easy to see everything that you did right on this, but I wonder.
Closer to the mic.
Oops, I'm sorry. I wonder, as journalists, whether you look back and say, I wish we had done something different.
With respect to what?
The actual gathering of information. If we had, it's an open-ended question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Do you look back and say, well, that really worked out perfectly just the way we expected? Or do you say, if I had it to do over again, I would have,
I don't see how we could have done it.
Well, no, that sounds like we were perfect. and we weren't.
No, we weren't perfect. I mean, there were a couple of mistakes made. I wish we hadn't made the mistake.
That's a really good question, because one of the things, what, do you know what I'm going to say?
No, go ahead. I don't know what you're going to say, but something
No,
occurred
one
to me.
of the things we could have looked at is, okay, like halfway through, we're saying we're finding what looks like, disparate treatment. We're finding what looks like agents requiring pre-approval of minorities while whites are not. We were looking at homes that were the average price on Long Island at the time, which was, I think, $520, $520.
Yeah.
So we could have concentrated the study in the affordable range, many more tests there to see if apparent discrimination is happening more in the middle, where common, everyday, regular people would be fighting for the scarce resource, which would be a nice home on Long Island in a good school district. But we, because we wanted to go wide, we did, way below 525 to see what was going on there. We were out in the Hamptons and the North Shore and did the $1 million testing. Perhaps we could have spent some of those resources, more in the middle where everyone could afford. Perhaps we could do what the previous questioner suggested is, a couple of tests just to see whether, Hempstead and Garden City could be tested in a different way than we did to see what happened there. Perhaps we could have done that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The other thing we thought about was looking at how those who are clearly identified or visually as
This is interesting.
as Muslims, and we attempted to do that, but we couldn't find enough testers to do that.
If you go into an agent's office
Wearing a
with
hijab
with
or-
hijab, right.
Yeah.
The other thing we could have done is line up our testers by skin tone and see if you got more discrimination at one end of the spectrum than you did at the other. And it wouldn't necessarily be about race, right? It would be about color. Next time.
You can go.
Okay. Hi. A lot of people don't look for themselves. They only pay attention to the surface or about, they pay attention to what they've heard or seen. I live in Elmont. So it does get a lot of negative publicity, even though there are a lot of positive things there. And I work in Garden City. And people, when they find out I work in Garden City, they say, oh, it's so great. I say, well, okay. There's a lot of drug abuse in Garden City.
Oh.
I'm not picking on Garden City. There's a lot of drug abuse in America. America makes up 4% of the world's population, uses 75% of the world's drugs. But, there's a lot of drug abuse in Garden City, a lot of domestic abuse, because people, I say to them, you're on Franklin or Hilton in a car. I'm on foot on the side streets, and I see the ugly underbelly that you're never going to see. And some parts of Garden City are swankier than others. I know from experience. And some of them look down on the other parts. Because I know everything. I know who's in rehab. I know who had a death in the family. I know who has a relative in jail. And there are people in Garden City that have relatives in jail. And we also deliver to Stewart Manor and Garden City South. And it's the same thing down over there as well.
Well, it's perception, right? It's people's perception.
Yeah.
And it's the real estate agent's perception about schools where, if you're in a minority district, the schools aren't good. And it's not necessarily the truth.
True.
Okay, thank you very much for this important investigation. So your results have told us the what, right? Your findings have informed us about, racial steering, that, there is this evidence that it's actually happening. So the next step would be, considering the significance, right, of this, is to identify the why. Conduct an analytical study to identify the determinants or the factors that motivate or that predict the racial steering that is being conducted by the real estate agents. So I'm just wondering, considering the interest in increased testing and increased funding towards this, do you have any plan in the future? So it's been 4 years now since the first study. Do you have a plan for a follow-up study on Long Island to identify the predictors?
Well, first of all,
If they did, would they tell you?
first of all, the legislation has just been signed by the governor in July, so we haven't had much time.
We spent a lot of money you know, doing this. So I don't know if we're going to get that kind of money ever again to do 100 tests and take 3 years. You know, but hopefully someone else will pick up the mantle because there's more resources around now than there were before we published the investigation. I hope something happens, and it doesn't have to be journalists, it could be students.
First, I want to thank you so much for your hard work in producing such an extensive and thorough report that hopefully will lead to positive change. So thank you so much for that. I have a question, just more a curiosity that your reporting made me think about. I'm not originally from Long Island. I moved here in 1997, 96, and I moved to Rockville Center in 1997. And when I first started thinking about living there, somebody told me that, you can't put, people in Rockville Center don't put, and I can't remember if it was can't or just don't, but they said they don't put like for sale signs on their lawn. And if you wanted to buy a house in Rockville Center, you had to go through a real estate agent. So now that I see your report, I kind of wonder, I guess it would take some research to find out if that was like cultural or if it was like a village ordinance, I don't know. But I was just wondering if you ever came across anything like that where there are certain communities where you have to go through a real estate agent to even look at homes in those communities.
I don't know, but it's interesting. I don't know about that. Do you know, Keith?
No, I don't think we came across anything like that. One of the things you could perhaps be critical about of the report was that not everyone uses a real estate agent when they buy a home. Mm-hmm. So what we captured is only this person-to-person market interaction. But you're right, a lot of homes don't even go on the market, so we don't know much about whether there's anything to be recorded there.
But it's interesting, Rockville Center was mentioned in our report in that we have a video of a black woman who lived in Rockville Center in the 1960s, but was urban renewal tore down the black neighborhood in Rockville Center, and she ultimately, the family moved to Hempstead. But they got rid of a lot of the black folks in Rockville Center in the 60s. So. But I know my co-op complex, you can't put a for sale sign out. I mean, and I don't live in Rockville Center. I live right 3 miles from campus here. But that's, so I don't know, maybe Rockville Center is using some
One
of that.
thing that I remember that came up too was the real estate agencies and the neighborhoods that they sort of have as their territory, right? I mean, I think that was also an issue, that there are some neighborhoods and communities of color where the bigger real estate agencies don't even bother listing, right? And that the smaller, they're sort of represented by smaller agencies, which also can limit.
Someone asked a question about one of the things we would do differently. We discussed for a moment the concept of renting a house and then seeing what real estate agents or whom real estate agent would bring to our listing. Would they bring mostly white residents, or would they bring a mix of people or not? We could have done it that way. I don't remember why we didn't, but
I didn't hear.
that might get at the question you asked if someone did it that way.
Oh, okay. I teach over on the other side at Nassau Community. and I teach sociology, and I talk about this. And I was looking at newsday.com/divided, and I thought it would be really wonderful if I could incorporate it into my class, into my lecture. And I put it into my phone, but I couldn't get to it. Do you have to subscribe to Newsday in
Now
order
you
to
do.
get to this video that you showed?
Now you do. For many years, for like 3 years, you could have gotten into it without subscribing, but now it's behind the paywall. Sorry.
Well, I think because it would have been a wonderful teaching thing, to supplement what I already
Yeah,
told them
yeah,
about study. And my other question is, there was a bill that you said was passed in Albany. Does it have a name? I would like to Google and find out more information about it. So does that bill have a name?
Well, it's not a bill anymore, it's law, so.
But does a law have,
Yeah.
does it have a name?
I don't know if it had a name, but there's a press release on the governor's website. You can find the details there. It's also in Newsday's archives, reporting about the signing of the bill in July. You can find it that way.
Okay, well, this was a great conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
There was one more question here. I don't want.
Sorry, oh, sure. I'm sorry, I missed one question. Bad moderator.
Rockville Center, I mean Lakeview, the community of Lakeview, they're always advertised under Rockville Center. It's never advertised under Lakeview. I just want to throw that out there. If you look it up, anytime there's a house in Lakeview for sale, it's always under Rockville Center. Yeah, but it's not the same school district or anything.
Yeah, I believe Lakeview might be Malvern School
Yeah.
District. Yeah.
So that's false.
I used to live in West Hempstead, a mile up Woodfield Road, so I was always
Yeah,
through
so
Lakeview.
that's really false advertising.
Yeah, the church there, the AME church there on Pershing is listed as Rockville Center, even though, yeah. Well, that's Long Island, right?
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you again to our panelists.